Thanks. Okay, thanks everyone for sticking around. I know it's Friday afternoon. We got a couple panels left. I'm sure we'll have plenty of good stuff to present to you. Let me begin just by reiterating the thanks that have been made to the organizers for the program, Sarah and Sean and Alice and others who put this program together. It's really terrific to be able to talk about public lands with a knowledgeable audience and group of speakers as we've had in this conference. I also want to give a shout out to our students and the young lawyers and young professionals who are here. You know, some of us who have been working on public lands for a long time are concerned, I think, about the future of public lands and advocates for public lands and people who are going to be engaged as future leaders on public lands. And it's been really encouraging to be here teaching at the University of Colorado to see so many of our young people who are really interested in this topic. And I really want to encourage you to make this a career, to make this a lifelong vocation, because it's so important that we have knowledgeable people who are at the forefront of these issues. We've been blessed with really outstanding people like John Leshy and our own Charles Wilkinson, of course, to help bring these issues to the forefront. But we're looking forward to seeing you up here at the table in future years when we have conferences like this, and we hope you will take up the cause. Okay, so this panel is focused on recreation, but it's a little different twist, I would say, on recreation than we might normally think about recreation. When you think about recreation on public lands, oftentimes we think about conflicts that exist with recreation on public lands, conflicts between resource development, as we've been talking about, conflicts maybe with different types of recreation, developed or motorized kinds of recreation, off-road vehicles, and maybe more primitive or contemplative kinds of recreation. We're going to sort of focus on not the conflict so much, but on just recreation generally, and probably with a focus a little bit more on the more contemplative side, hiking and cross-country skiing, and maybe just being out on the public lands and enjoying their sublime beauty. I want to sort of begin just by noting how popular our public lands really are. The Department of the Interior just yesterday released the most recent statistics on visitors to our national parks. And last year, 2019, we had 327.5 million visitors to our national parks. If you compare that with our population, it is 99.4% of our total population. So almost everybody went to a park, or at least it seems that way, or at least a lot of people probably made multiple visits. But the point is, these are really popular places, and I would just remind you that this is just the parks. We have much more land in our national forests and our BLM public land, which of course also offer many popular recreational opportunities. And so this is a huge resource. I would note, by the way, that the little park up the road from here, Rocky Mountain National Park, had its most visitors ever last year. 4.67 million people visited Rocky Mountain National Park last year. So really remarkable. We are only behind the Great Smoky Mountains and the Grand Canyon in terms of the number of visitors. So recreation is really important to our public lands. But beyond just thinking about recreation, what we want to do today is not so much talk about recreation numbers or statistics or what the lands are being used for. We want to talk about the people who are getting out to our public lands and asking some questions about who they are and how can we expand the community of people who are using our public lands. In our first panel this morning, we heard some really interesting presentations from Alan Spears and Oriana Sandoval about some of the issues that communities face in recreating on our public lands. And we're going to, I think, expand on that a little bit with our panel today. And to help us do that, we have three great panelists. I will only briefly introduce them. Their full bios are in the program, and you should look at them. They're all very accomplished people. We're going to begin with Sarah Krakoff, who is our Moses Lasky Professor of Law here at the law school, and she is an expert and frequent author on subjects that we're talking about at this conference: public lands, environmental justice, Native American kinds of issues. Sarah's really one of the outstanding faculty members that we have here at the law school. After Sarah, we're going to hear from Teresa Martinez. Teresa's been working on national trail kinds of issues for many years now, about 30 years, I think. Teresa's been involved in working on national trails. She spent quite a number of years on the Appalachian Trail issues, and more recently is working as the executive director of, and co-founder, I should add, of the Continental Divide Trail Coalition. So that little trail that's right fairly close to our home, right? At least it comes through our state of Colorado, and we are grateful for that. And finally, we're going to hear from Jose Gonzalez. Jose is an experienced educator, and he's involved in both formal and informal kinds of education. He works with diverse communities in a wide range of areas, including on how people might engage in opportunities to relate to their natural environment. So each of them is going to offer a little different perspective on people and recreation. So let's start with Sarah.
Thank you, Mark, and all of you here. Thanks to my students. You know you are my inspiration, and the reason why, I keep doing this all this time, and to my colleagues. And I also want to thank, as Rebecca Sosi did, John Leshy for his amazing talk last night, and also for my friends and mentors here at the law school, some, thank goodness, still here, Charles, and some gone too soon, David Getches. And I thought I'd start by talking about one way of thinking about 1/3 of our nation's lands, the public lands. There is certainly a way to think about them that is rooted in the sort of imperial government as owner. And as Annie talked about earlier. And I understand, of course, that is a perspective felt by many communities. The communities that I have worked with and written about most in that regard are Native communities, and how the public lands were created out of what was once all Indian country. And Rebecca Sosi averted to that earlier, as has several other speakers. But I think here's another way to think about 1/3 of the nation's land that does not erase that history and absolutely cannot, and that's as our commons, all of our commons, including tribal peoples, including people who have felt marginalized by preservation, including rural communities, including Black and brown communities who haven't always felt a part of the conservation movement. It is a commons, and if it had been privatized, instead of being held in public ownership with increasing degrees of protection and management for all the people, and that regulatory revolution that took place, I realize it's funny to talk about a regulatory revolution, but it was. I heart regulation is a bumper sticker I would like to make one day. But that happened in the 60s and 70s that I was not a part of. I was too young then, is what brought the people in to the story of managing and owning our public lands. And that's been, it's not a straight line story as I see it. There was resistance and there still is to that. But it gives us what I sort of like to think about is a place to fight about all these values that we wouldn't have if these lands had been privatized, right? And that is the beauty of things remaining public. And that, I think, I worry, is a value that is at risk right now. The notion that things can and should be open to all of us, not to agree about, but to fight about. There are places where we can work out what our common values either are or should be. And it's sort of, I wanted to start there by voicing my full-throated support for the continued public and common ownership of our public lands, notwithstanding their troubled history, which is the same history as the troubled history of our nation, which is sort of the historical backstory, the legal and political historical backstory to, I think, some of the access and relatability issues we might say about our public lands. And so I hope I can do this pretty quickly, and I really feel like what I'm doing is setting it up for Teresa and Jose. And also relating back to Alan's comments of this morning, and Alan knows this. I met him some years back now and have been ripping off his Not America's Best Idea paper that he wrote, op-ed that he wrote for High Country News ever since. And maybe my way of redeeming it is to say that it's certainly not yet America's best idea, but maybe it gives us a space to work out what it might be. Okay, with that opening point, thinking of our public lands as our commons, our space to work these things out, then the second thing I want to say is it's very, very difficult to generalize about the ways in which anybody relates to our public lands, any particular demographic group, any racial group, any group from a different class background. And so I'm going to be making some probably terrible overgeneralizations because it's very, very personal, the way we all relate to the space around us. And I want to continue the idea that Charles started and Rebecca continued for us today of our public lands, our commons, not being something that is separate and apart from us, not being like a medium that we act on. That's definitely how we think and talk about natural resources, but it's not at all how we experience them. We don't experience our lives in grid lines and maps. We experience them as things we move through, ideas and memories we take with us, whether we're there or not. When you're hiking, say, in Grand Canyon, or meandering through your favorite local park with families picnicking and so forth, you're not thinking about crossing a certain boundary. You're just moving through time and space. And so in that sense, every single relationship with the public lands is highly personal and subjective. But of course, we also live our lives encoded in these categories that we didn't make up ourselves, and that we were born into because of structures that preceded us, legal and political structures in the United States. And so maybe that's all a way of saying, I'm going to make some generalizations, but don't make too much of them. So now I want to move to sort of what I think of as my political and legal backstory. How and why is it that certain groups experience and approach their relationship to the public lands differently from what we might think of as, the classic, white lone backpacker experience? How and why is it, apart from, of course, all our individual subjective experiences? Well, our laws and policies that have constructed all of our infrastructure and all of our relationships to space and places are part of that explanation. And I'm going to talk about just two examples, but I think to start, I'll sort of talk about different phases and ways in which laws and policies relating to our public lands have constructed different relationships for different groups of people. First, public land law in its early disposition days did the work of wresting land from indigenous peoples, from American Indian tribes. That was the coincidence of certain federal Indian law policies with certain federal public land policies. And I'm whipping through this really fast. But then the second phase of public land law, the early era of conservation, coincided with the policies of Indian reservations, right? So again, we had a concentration and increasing sort of shrinkage of native lands relative to the expansion of federal public lands for the purposes both of disposition early on, but then in part two, sort of in the early era of conservation. And one sort of concrete example you can have in your minds for this is Grand Canyon National Monument, designated by Teddy Roosevelt in 1908, and then eventually, of course, as became a national park after the National Park Service Organic Act was passed. And all of that land, all of that land was once Indian country. And there are today 11 federally recognized tribes who have rights to consultation with regards to what happens in the park. But of course, not a single one of them has a homeland in the park. And there have been hard-fought negotiations for some, like Havasupai, to get some of their lands back. But for many of the tribes, and I'm going to talk in a second in particular about the Kaibab Paiute, their current reservations are tiny and nowhere near their traditional Aboriginal homelands in the heart of Grand Canyon. So stories of exclusion and expulsion coincident with also are stories of the continued evolution and development of public lands. Second, there are stories of the role that law played with regard to communities of color, but particularly African American communities, of terror and segregation that seem sort of distant from our stories of public land law. But I'm going to try to connect them up for you in at least one way, also a story connected to Grand Canyon. But in general, we can think of it this way. As our national parks became a public going concern in about the post-World War II era, right, when American prosperity was on the rise, people were hitting the highways and going to visit the parks were promoting themselves by virtue of their access to public roadways, which is, by the way, only part 2 of the role of the railroads and protected public lands, but I don't have time to go into that. That's another Indian law story, too. We were in the heart of the Jim Crow era of segregation. And there were lots and lots of spaces and places, and again, Alan adverted to this earlier, where African Americans just couldn't safely go, just as white America was discovering and enjoying our great public lands. And this is an anecdote as opposed to any kind of thoroughgoing study. But I did look up the Green Book for the 1960s, which was a book that African American travelers used to figure out where was a safe place to go, what hotels, motels, and towns might they visit, where they wouldn't be turned away and discriminated against. And in the state of Arizona, where the Grand Canyon is, there were only 2 places in the Green Book, and they were in the cities of Tucson and Phoenix. So none up in the areas proximate to our great national public lands and protected parks. And then finally, and again in broad swaths, what about Latinx communities? How did law structure their relationships with our public lands? There were also the same kinds of segregation, redlining, and so forth for Latinx communities as for African American communities during the post-World War II era of prosperity that cut those communities off too from the kinds of activities that white Americans, as they became more prosperous, were able to engage in, including visiting our national parks and so forth. And then there's another story, and there are many, many more. Again, I'm just giving you examples, which is from areas like New Mexico and southern Colorado, such as the San Luis Valley, which are stories about how areas that were considered public lands, commonses, like Mount Taylor, for example, was a commons that the people of the San Luis Valley used for collecting firewood, recreating, and engaging in their traditional subsistence livelihood, which became unpublic because of what happened after the Mexican-American War of 1848, when those land grants were privatized without the community's understanding or knowing that until a private landowner locked the gates and shut them out. So these are all just ways in which law constructed different groups' relationships with the public lands that don't just end when the legal story ends. And the legal story, by the way, hasn't ended. But these are all the structures that we all sort of carry around with us that affect the ways that we relate to these amenities, right? These amazing places that have all those aesthetic and ecological values that we've been discussing. So I'm going to just now give a little bit more detail about a couple of these stories to give you a sense of how it is that law played a role, sort of mutually constituted with economic policies, I would suggest, in sort of shaping how different constituencies were able to relate to our public lands. And they both, again, grow out of Arizona, just because this is the work I've been doing most recently, although I hope to expand it. So going back to that era of the sort of post-World War II big buildup, as my colleague and friend Charles Wilkinson called it. I think the story about the big buildup's relationship, right, between the exportation of coal and other fossil fuel resources from an area we call the Colorado Plateau, that led to the development of big southwestern cities like Phoenix and Tucson, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas, had negative impacts on the native communities in the Southwest. I think that's, in my world, that's a fairly well-known story, although it's probably still not well-known enough, right? So you had resource development coupled with what it's fair to say is purposeful underdevelopment on the Navajo Nation, Hopi tribe, and so forth, plus the beginnings of a dependency on a fossil fuel economy. What I want to do is draw the picture just a little bit bigger and suggest that at the same time, and I referred to this earlier, that was going on, there was the rise of the modern environmental movement, right? A sense that as we're building up cities, we want big places to play and appreciate and love and for their aesthetic value. Right? So that's connected, right? The rise of the modern environmental movement is connected to the impoverishment of Indian country and the buildup of the big cities. And then the last piece of it, again, I referenced this earlier so I can be brief, is that those cities in their initial times were segregated by law. So you have, if we can link this whole landscape together, a landscape limited by structures of inequality, often race-based and race-coded, providing amenities and privileges for some, and underdevelopment and lack of opportunities for others. So that's to pull that whole landscape together. And then very briefly, maybe in my last minute, the story of the Kaibab Paiute, who used to inhabit all of the North Rim along with their southern Paiute relatives. I'll just leave you with this image. Today, if you raft the Grand Canyon or hike down from the North Rim, there's an area called Deer Creek Falls, which has famous petroglyphs. And if you take the risk of looking at the wall to your right or left, depending on which way you're walking, you'll see these sort of ghostly handprints on the walls, and everybody stops and takes pictures. They're extraordinary. There are these ancient petroglyphs, and everybody wonders, what's the story behind those? Who made them? Well, this is Kaibab Paiute country, and my guess is the Kaibab people know the answer to that question. But their presence is erased for virtually every visitor to the canyon, including most of the Grand Canyon guides that I've met. Their reservation today is tiny. It's many miles from the North Rim of the Grand Canyon, and yet this is their place. They're not gone. They still visit. But you can imagine that their relationship and sense of how to celebrate our public lands is quite different from the 20,000 people who say raft the river every year. I'm going to stop because my time is up, and I just wanted to start with the history because the history matters. It doesn't trap us or limit us because thank goodness we still have this commons in which to work it all out, and the communities who have been marked by these exclusions and segregations also love and enjoy the public lands, just as almost all Americans do. And so I just thought we'd start with that setup and thank my fellow speakers and Mark and turn it over to them.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I have been thinking about this for the last, 2 or 3 weeks today, wondering like if I was going to really just be way off base with what I'm going to share with you, and I realized that it's actually the perfect setup. And all day today, I think everyone has touched on such the breadth of things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis with the Continental Divide Trail. So first, let me just tell you a little bit about myself and the organization and the actual Continental Divide National Scenic Trail, because I think it's important for context for the things I'm going to share. I am the executive director and co-founder of the national nonprofit, the lead national nonprofit, the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, that works with the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service in the management and administration of the Continental Divide National Scenic Trail. We are a federally MOU'd organization with a federal agency, so we're not an advocacy group. We're this weird public-private partnership that sort of works in this weird space in this public lands but quasi-private world. It's a very complex thing, and part of that is because of the way the law was set up. So I just want to do a quick, let's see if I go that way. Look at that. All right, so let me just give you a real quick tutorial for those of you who don't know anything about the National Trail System. Starting in 1965, President Johnson delivered a speech on natural beauty. And in this speech, he made a case for protecting natural places in the public domain and proposed the establishment of a national system of trails. And in his speech, and this is during that time that Sarah, you just alluded to in this environmental time, he talked about not just the importance of having places where people could go to and get away from the modern technology of the world in the late 60s, but a place where the concern is not just with nature alone, but with the total relation between humans and the world around us, and its object is not just human welfare, but the dignity of the human spirit. And it's, to me, to this day, still really profound that President Johnson, who did a lot of other things, had this spiritual way of talking about public places. And then it drove him then to direct the federal agencies to explore this idea of a national trail system. And so in 1966, they released the Trails for America report, which basically said, yes, we should have a national system of trails. And then on October 2nd, 1968, the National Trail System Act was passed and created a system of trails, scenic trails, historic trails, and recreation trails for the enjoyment of the American public. Scenic trails are these trails like the Continental Divide, the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail that are these scenic experiences around these nationally significant natural, cultural, historical, and scenic resources of our country. Historic trails are things like the Lewis and Clark Trail, tracing the expansion, the westward expansion to Oregon, California, but they're also trails like the Selma to Montgomery Trail, which captures the history of the civil rights movement. The Trail of Tears, which talks about, in a very real way, the expulsion of the Cherokee to Oklahoma in this forced march. But it also recognizes things like the Juan de Anza Batiste National Historic Trail, which traces the immigrant and trade routes across the Southwest between Santa Fe and San Diego. So it's this incredible system. Today, well, let me just tell you a little bit more. Oh, let me go back there real quick. I also want to mention in this picture, this is the day the National Trail System Act was passed. It's the same day the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed, and this is the same day the Redwood National Park was created by Congress. The other important thing to know is scenic and historic trails are congressionally designated, and then this other class, recreational trails, are actually administratively created by agencies. And that's a very important distinction. But I want to mention this picture because there's one lone figure in this image amongst a lot of other figures in this image. And if any of you who are old enough to know who that is, she's the real reason why the National Trail System Act exists. Lady Bird Johnson was an avid outdoors person. There's also Stuart Udall, and they would recreate a lot. And that's one of the reasons why the National Trail System Act exists today, and the Wild and Scenic Rivers. But I also just think it's a pretty stark image. No comment. Just saying. Anyway, so let's talk about the National Trail System Act. So there's three basic tenets about this legislation. First of all, these national trails should provide for the maximum outdoor recreation potential of the places that they exist. The second thing is that they should be there for the conservation and enjoyment of the natural, cultural, scenic, and historic resources. So it's a dual mandate. And oftentimes we are pitted at each other. You can't have a ton of recreation and then not protect the trail, but you're supposed to protect the landscape. But how do you do that with all these people? If any of you have thru-hiked the AT or been on the AT and seen the thousands and thousands of people, I don't know how that's an awesome experience, but people love it. I prefer the CDT, where there's like 10 people and a lot of bears. A little bit different, but I'm also not everybody. And the other really critical thing is it requires a public-private partnership to exist. So there's this mandate within the federal government. It's the only time I personally believe Congress got it right to engage the public in the actual management and administration of these systems, these public lands. And it requires us to sort of sit at the table. The federal government, they still do NEPA, they make the decisions, they do all the law enforcement. But like, for example, in the case of the CDT, we do everything else because the agencies do not have capacity to manage across all the different jurisdictions, deal with people. They just can't answer the phone when someone's like, where is the water source? The agencies don't know how to do that or don't have capacity to. So today, there are over 30 national scenic and historic trails, over 1,200 recreation trails that connect all 50 states of the Union, including Alaska and Hawaii, and they represent over 50,000 miles of connected, publicly protected trails. And I should tell you one last piece is that they're really not trails at all, at least not the National Scenic and Historic Trails. They're actually corridors. It's a little sneaky thing Congress did as well. When they wrote the act, they talked about these being experiences, not necessarily 18 to 24-inch treads. Because how can you actually provide an experience without protecting the things around the physical thing you're walking on? And if any of you have been listening to the cow pasture thing, don't go there right now. That's like a whole other conversation I don't want to get into. But a trail is actually, a national scenic or historic trail is actually a corridor of experience. It's not just the 18 to 24-inch tread. Okay, I think that's all the important things there. So let's talk about the CDT in this vein. The Continental Divide Trail is 3,100 miles long. It runs from the literally tip of the New Mexican border in the boot heel of New Mexico all the way up to Glacier Waterton International Peace Park. And you actually cross out of the US and Canada to actually finish the trail. And then you have to actually come through customs to get back into the US, which is interesting. And on the border of New Mexico, in Mexico, it's a 6-strand barbed wire fence where you literally can put your toe in Mexico and nothing happens. It's not what you see on TV. It's a totally different world. And we actually like it that way. But when we talk about things like border walls, it changes the whole nature and purpose down there. We go through 20 national forests, 4 national parks, and 3 big ones: Glacier, Rocky Mountain, Yellowstone, and then the El País National Monument. And then we go through 13 BLM resource areas and 5 states: New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. The CDT was created because it's in this remote location. You guys live here in Boulder, come to Boulder, you know the mountains are big, they're really up there. They're not as remote as they think they are, but they are pretty exposed. Their high elevation, the average elevation is 10,500 feet from Mexico to Canada, and it goes along the Continental Divide. It's the major watershed of the North American continent. It's kind of a big deal. It's where it all flows. It's where we all connect. It's where we all begin. It marks the history of the American West. So from mining to the indigenous cultures to logging to all the things that happen across the American West, which oftentimes also involves rural, small communities. Denver is the largest population center we have along the CDT. Unlike the AT and PCT, which have these huge population centers, stewards, whole history of stuff, the West is not like that. And we don't want it to be like East or West Coast. We want it distinctly about the American West. And so we've had to do some work to embrace and share why that's so special. The other critical thing about the CDT is it connects these diverse ecosystems, cultures, and communities and experiences, literally from desert to glacier. I usually ask people when I talk about this, do you know where the lowest point on the CDT is? And people are always like, New Mexico. And I'm like, actually, it's Montana. And it's actually on the border of Canada and Montana at Waterton Lake by 100 feet. The other second lowest place is, in fact, New Mexico. But so I always tell people you walk downhill. It's all downhill from here. They're heading north. They believe me sometimes, and then they realize I'm totally lying. The CDT was actually established 10 years after the original National Trail System Act through a series of amendments to the act in 1978 that President Carter signed into law. And this is unique because the first 2 trails that were created in 1968 were in fact the Appalachian and Pacific Crest Trails. And they gave, when Congress created them, they sort of said, you can do this, and you can do this, you can't do this, and you can't do this. But when they got to the CDT, they kind of said, just whatever you do, make sure it doesn't substantially interfere with the nature and purposes for which the CDT was created. You guys are a bunch of law students and lawyers. You probably get the nuance of substantially interfere better than the American public does. But I can tell you, for many, many years, it's been my biggest frustration in dealing with how we talk about who, what, when, and where, and how. People, projects, developments, even the trail itself. How do we manage this trail when you don't have any definitives? It's sort of figure it out. Does it impact it now? Will it impact it tomorrow? What are the cumulative impacts? I don't know. We have to sort of look in this crystal ball and sort of go like, put all these pieces together. So I think that's important. And what that has led to is this definition of substantial interference. At times, the CDT is open to bikes. Other times, the trail is actually still open to motorized use instead, even though the National Trail System Act sort of says all national scenic trails should generally be non-motorized. But on the CDT, because of when it was created and the only way you connect a trail from Mexico to Canada across 3,100 miles is by putting it on existing routes sometimes. And if those routes were actually open and designated open to motorized use in 78, they still are open to motorized use today, and that will never change. So we have this really weird nuance of how we work together. And it's sort of created an opportunity for us to be collaborative, because we can't just come in and say yes or no. We have to bring people to the table and say, how are we going to do this in the best way to protect both the nationally significant natural, cultural, historical, and cultural resources and maximize outdoor recreation potential for the American public. And there's no answer, there's no right answer, but there is a right process. And that's all I know these days, is that it's about process and democracy, truly, bringing people to the table and trying to hash that out. And sometimes it takes a long time. So these are legacy projects for a reason, which is great. So as we've sort of explored what the CDT means for us as an organization, as a community, as we've worked with the local communities up and down the trail, and we actually work with a lot of the rural communities along the CDT. We have a Gateway Community Designation Program, and we have Lincoln, Montana, Salida, Colorado, and most recently we have Lordsburg, New Mexico. And if any of you have ever been to Lordsburg, New Mexico, there's not much going on in Lordsburg, but there is the CDT walking right down Main Street, and they are embracing it like crazy. And we're all about it. We think that's great because, as Rebecca mentioned, it services, I tell people, through hikers are not poor, they're just thrifty. So if you have a beer, you have a shower, and you have a bed, you're probably going to win on one or all three of those things in a small town in the middle of nowhere in the American West. And then the best part is you may have these people come through, and then they're going to leave, and they're not going to stay, but you get the benefit of them coming through town. And then you get the stories and the connections and all the other things that come with them. So like as I said, the CDT challenges us as a managing partner to sort of be different, to think different, to act differently, because we've sort of started to recognize that how we connect is as important as why we connect to this resource. As we've started looking at the CDT, we've realized that it's really about landscape and not about the trail itself, that people connect to the Continental Divide all up and down its length because they live there, and they have lived there for generations. And so we sort of launched last year an effort called Faces of the Continental Divide for us to sort of expand who we see on the trail. It's not just the white guy in short shorts with $5,000 worth of gear. That is some of them, but that's only 1% of who's actually out there on the trail. There's a 99%, it's 99% too of who people see, but there's this whole other group of people who see the CDT. And I just want to share with you, if it works, and I'm going to go over time, but I think it's worth it. We did this little video with Xochitl Torres Small, actually, down in southern New Mexico, that actually puts the voices of why the CDT is important, why protecting these places are important. And I'll just let their voices speak. I'll just do that. And bear with me. Hopefully this works. Wait for it. Oh, you can't see it. Oh, no.
The stories that we share and that we build in the outdoors are part of what makes us who we are. So many of my firsts were in the Gila. So my first backpacking trip with my family. And my first hunting trip with my husband was in the Gila. It's a thriving and important ecosystem.
Okay, we'll try again. It's really worth it.
The stories that we share and that we build in the outdoors are part of what makes us who we are. So many of my firsts were in the Gila. So my first backpacking trip with my family and my first hunting trip with my husband was in the Gila. It's a thriving and important ecosystem.
You have the desert flatlands coming in to Grant County from Deming. And then you come into the mountains and people don't expect there to be pine tree forests here. And of course, the diversity of all the animals that live here. It's unlike anywhere in the world.
The Gila is a special place because it tells a story. It tells a story for some people about creation, like the Chiricahua Apache. It tells a story about the nation's first wilderness. It tells a story about communities like Silver City and Bayard and Hurley. And now it tells a story about what we need to do to conserve these places.
Each community, there are people who have and are building attachments to this great shared story that we have.
When you engage authentically with communities that are on the land that use these resources, in our case here in New Mexico, it's predominantly communities of color and people of color. When you let them lead and you empower folks to be able to tell their stories, that's really what makes an impact.
I'm proud to see public lands as a uniting force and to know that New Mexico is a key part of that we build and that we are continuing to build together.
I can't help myself. It's who I am. Sorry, I've got a microphone, a lot of people. It's going to happen. I might need tech to come help me. Oh, there it is. Okay. So this weekend that we were up here for 2 days in Lake Roberts doing this video, and while we were there, we finished up with Sochi. She left because you know how Congress people, they have to leave after they're there for like an hour. And then we were all sitting there. We had a bunch of beer. I'm not going to lie. And it was 10 a.m., but we had been up early. And we had also already spent the night before out at Lake Roberts, kind of talking about what we were going to do and what we were going to talk about and how we were going to do this whole thing. And so my friends Gabe Vasquez with the Nuestra Tierra Project, Angel Peña, who's also with the Nuestra Tierra Conservation Project, my friend Simon Peter, who's right here, who's a Gateway Community Ambassador for us in Silver City and also works for NM Wild. And then some other colleagues of ours from Silver City, New Mexico. And this particular woman, her name is Angelica. She was in the video, but she goes by Healy. And we were out there and we're drinking beer and fishing in Lake Roberts, and we're not catching anything but moss. But we're talking about being brown, being Hispanic, being fishing, talking about how we got to where we were in that moment. And this whole thing happened to us where I think we just collectively just had this moment. And Geely says, and she also happens to be a mariachi performer. And she's like, I have to sing a song for you. And we're like, yes, you do. And we were the only people at Lake Roberts. And I should also tell you, I'm a Leave No Trace master. I'm an educator of Leave No Trace masters. And they tell you there's a whole list of things you're supposed to do and not do. Don't do this, do this, do this. Respect other visitors, respect wildlife, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh my God, we should not be doing this. We should not be doing this. And so I just sort of said, do it anyways. I wasn't going to be the Leave No Trace police. And so she sang for us. And probably won't do it. I was going to play her song. And I would play that for you because after she was done, we just sort of had this moment of realizing, and for me, very deeply, professionally, shifted the way I look at how we manage the CDT and how we've created these constructs of elitism around policies, procedures, and regulation. You're supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do this. But for most people, when they connect in public places, in natural places, with people they care about, they've gotten to know, they connect with. That's what's most important, is singing and sharing who you are, where you come from, and why you're there. And it's something that fundamentally shifts your DNA. I mean, that's the only way I can describe it. And that's, for me, what shifted the way we've been looking at the CDT, even beyond the faces of the divide, beyond how we manage in this collaborative space, that recognizing we're still missing something. We have this national trail system that basically has all of these stories of America. But oftentimes those organizations are run by people who are white and may have connection to a lot of the stories, especially in the historical trails, but aren't always the best voices or the complete voices. It's not a but. It's an and. We have this opportunity and a moral responsibility to be sharing these stories in a way that really does. Yes, we should have leave no trace. Those are important things. But we should also soften the edges around why and when and how we employ some of these constructs that we've had to protect these places we love so much, so that other people can love them as much as we do, because they're welcome, they connect, and they themselves can experience places like this and be moved emotionally to actually, Julie now writes LTEs all the time in support of Wild and Scenic Designation for the Gila, for land and water conservation funding, and she owns a house cleaning business in Silver City, New Mexico. She's from Hurley, New Mexico, and she's one of the most avid advocates we have in southern New Mexico now. And so that's just what I would leave you with. I'm sorry I couldn't play her song because it'd be blow your mind. She's amazing. But I do think that's where we're heading, and I think that as I listen to all of you today, I think that's the important thing. It goes back to Lyndon Johnson's comment about the dignity of the human spirit has to be part of all of this, that we can't go so caught up in the constructs of the things that we use to manage and protect these places without forgetting what makes us fundamentally human. So, thank you.
All right, as that's getting set up, buenas tardes. Hello. There's any raza, ¿qué hubo? I take that as a no. So my name is Jose Gonzalez, Jose Guadalupe Adonis Gonzalez Rosales de Leon. I want to start off by acknowledging some of the ancestral traditionals, but also unceded, occupied and stolen lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute, in addition to many more. That's just the start of it, because obviously there's a whole history that needs to be recognized and a whole reconciliation process that goes along with that. It's not just stating it. Also, as a cisgendered male, my pronouns are he, him, his, although I also respond to they, them, theirs, or anything offered with respect. And then, because I don't think this was caught in the beginning, and there's only the Twitter team I've noticed is a team of one, if you tweet or Instagram as well, the handle is CU Boulder, GWC, hashtag Martz Symposium. There's a few others, but I encourage you to kind of do that, because you'll be surprised that it can get out there to some people that want to hear this. So have at it, okay? And then last and most important, if you have not registered to vote, I won't shame you on that one, though. So start off with that. In terms of what brings me here, I recognize a lot of the faces on that past video. I'm actually fortunate that a lot of the conversation has been happening. I do have some connections. And so that's great, because I too at the beginning was thinking, wait, how did I get invited here? And then I realized, actually there's a lot to contribute in that space. This is gonna be really pithy. I'm going to only give you about 10 minutes of what is normally a 3-hour presentation and a full day conversation. So I want to really phrase that and to kind of give an idea of kind of the work that's at hand here. I'm an immigrant from Mexico, and then came over at a young age, grew up in the Central Valley of California. Oldest of all my family, first to go to college, graduate school, and so forth. In fact, that path of the pronghorn that was up there earlier, part of that was my master's project. So I worked as part of a master's thesis project with five other individuals, 5 other graduate students, as what we were looking at is what is landscape conservation look like when we're looking at this specific migration corridor? And back then, just the idea that we would have an overpass was fascinating, and now here it is. And then lastly, as I'm going to start here, is I really jumped into, my background is in education, but I really jumped into kind of the conservation and public land conversation with the previous administration, with the Obama administration. Back then, once I decided to kind of start my own nonprofit, Latino Outdoors, we got really engaged, especially as part of the National Monument designation. I started off with the Berryessa Snow Mountain designation, then got involved in a few other coalitions. It's a great time. There was a lot to do. In fact, I sat in Mike Connor's office a couple times. I'm sure he doesn't remember, but I do. And then, one of the culminations was also I got to do a great National Monument designation ceremony in the Oval Office with the president, which was fantastic. We got to view a film about Latinos in the outdoors as a White House-sponsored event. And then, of course, the Presidential Memorandum on Public Lands and Equity and Inclusion and Diversity as one of the final things that he signed off. So that's part of kind of my policy pieces jumping in here. In terms of, and that's my handle too for anyone of interest, what brings me here is really to think about these larger ideas and frameworks. For me, I'm not a lawyer in any way by training. I've had the benefit of working with many in graduate school colleagues who went to law school and looking at public lands. Because for me, I really still want to understand that law is a tool, right? It's a tool and a practice, and law is not the same as justice. And so it's important to understand how the tools that we have now, the history that they're embedded in and how they get here, but also that they're not permanent, right? That's part of why I get involved in policy at the federal level and at the state level in California to say, what is it, when we talk about equity, what does that look like in terms of the policy and then the law that gets put on paper, that's codified, to have equity to address historical inequity. So that's, for example, how I approach this. If you're not familiar with the Green 2.0 report, that's one of the first things that really came out several years ago to try to put some of these numbers to what was predominantly just kind of qualitative data or just anecdotal to be able to say, hey, as people of color, there are many of us that care about environmental work and whatnot, but we're not really represented in the field. We can count ourselves. There's a whole way in which we talked about that. And this out of the University of Michigan, Dr. Rosita Taylor had like 3 main findings. You can find this online, which this idea of a green ceiling, this idea that there's unconscious bias, discrimination, and insular recruiting. That's part of the work that I also do now with like equity and inclusion facilitation and design workshops. And then a lackluster effort and disinterest in addressing diversity. So big takeaway was that you were beginning to have a lot of organizations say, this matters to us. This whole idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, it's important. And then when you really got to this, like, so what are you doing about it? What are you willing to do about it? There was a gap. Right? In terms of, this is the Nature of Americans report in 2017. And I put this because when I talk about recreation for me, it is acknowledging, yes, this is the debate we have within like traditional conversations around our public lands and recreation. And as Teresa said, there's a whole other stuff going on. And are we paying attention to how it's happening, why it's happening? For me, the question that I would often guess is, do Latinos care about outdoor recreation? Do they want to be involved in the outdoors? Is that we got to move past that question to how do they care and how should we be paying attention to that care and concern? So these, for me, are little pieces, especially research over the past 10 years that didn't exist 10 years before that, to be able to say, here it is. Let's pay attention to it. So in this question, the demographic categories are white, Hispanic, Black, and Asian, and the question is interest in hiking by race and ethnicity. When you see a lot, you see that the highest percentage there at 45% is actually Hispanic. And the lowest is Black. Right? That's for hiking. But if you ask the question, walking outdoors, you see how that shifts to now they're all pretty high. Hispanic is still high, but you see also how Black is second. It's not the lowest anymore, right? Which begs the question, what is the difference between hiking and walking outdoors, right? But it's begin to understand then what we mean about cultural constructs about outdoor recreation. What does it look like? Are you legit because you have that REI membership or that Patagonia brand? What does that mean? How do we include that? In addition, for the outdoor industry, which is getting, it's great finally that the outdoor industry is I'll just say this in the way that I'll say it, is that they're recognizing, as we said before, that a healthy outdoor recreation economy relies on sustained, protected public lands, federal, state, of all kinds, right? You need a place to recreate in, first of all. And even there, as we're looking kind of like, well, what is this idea of representation? And these are some of the reports that they're coming. And again, these are all snapshots, right? They're not all inclusive. For me, what's important is they begin to really unpack some of these presumptions and questions, but also add complexity to, that idea of saying, how could both of these ideas exist in the same place? Well, they do. So let's approach them by understanding that type of nuance and complexity. And even here, knowing that as Latinos, as Latinx communities, they may be underrepresented in outdoor recreation, those that are participating, for example, may spend more hours than the average outdoors enthusiast. They might consider themselves more outdoorsy than the average outdoor enthusiast, and they will still be spending more money. So they are shopping on REI, for example, in addition to Walmart. And this participation report just came out this year for last year. They're still tinkering and working on the methodology because you always have to ask the question, what counts as recreation? But it's looking at kind of participation rates over the years and how you have this question of saying, well, Black participation may seem pretty low. And rather than presuming, well, then it's just low, it's maybe asking what's being counted, what's not being counted. And let's look at that study before in terms of how is the question being asked and framed, but also the historical perception of, is that for me or not? And how are we inviting each other into that conversation? But then, of course, noticing that for all other demographics, it's going up. In fact, in this case, the one that's dipping a little bit is white. Last, in terms of these frameworks, will be around just general environmental concern, care, awareness, regulation, especially around renewable energy, climate change, and so forth. So persistently over 70%, 80%. In fact, in many cases, Latinx communities tend to be some of the highest rated. Sometimes it's African American and Black communities. So 86% Latino support increased conservation of water. So these have been coming out over the past few years. Right? They're putting numbers on some of these ideas to challenge the question of how communities of color, for example, care and recreate and care about the outdoors. And so, for example, a big takeaway here is that African, Asian, and Hispanic Latino Americans are convinced on climate change. So sometimes people say, how will we get them to care? I'm like, are you paying attention how they already care and what you may need to do to support that type of engagement? Your work actually might be on some white demographics that have some power and privilege that are leveraging that to resist what you're doing. And maybe you would have to be thinking about how to shift some of that opportunity to get some of that help. Because then I land on this question, which is, if we know interest in care, for example, interest and concern is high for quote unquote people of color communities, then how and why does it account for underrepresentation? So it allows us to move into these questions of like systemic and structural issues. When we talk about it, it's not the care and concern, it's when we're talking about institutional discrimination or dealing with the effects of historical exclusion, that's the question. And it is hard, it is uncomfortable, and yet it is part of the transition because part of the conservation success that we've had over the past 50, 100 years has relied on a demographic block that's rapidly shifting and it's going to look very different over the next 50, 100 years. And that includes them also being in leadership. Right? So California, also my home state, that's a perfect example. Now all of a sudden you have the legislature headed by Latinos, you have a lot of elected officials who say, yeah, I might be a Democrat, I care about the concern, but also came from these communities. So I don't want you to come with me with the old argument and approach. I want you to really start thinking about how my lived experience is also a factor of this. Right? And so this is my last two slides here. So this is that shift about looking at, as we, as Alan said, or I think maybe I just read that in the tweet, rather than thinking of national parks as America's best idea, if we have this idea of justice-oriented path, as holding true to that idea, has been that we've been saying, at least, for example, since the 60s, let's actually take the signs down. that say segregation is happening. Let's work with the laws. Culturally, that's a different thing. We've been dealing with that for quite a while. And we had a civil rights legislation in the 1860s, for example, right after the Civil War. And those were quickly undone. Because we also have to account for the culture change, but also still who's wielding power and what does that representation look like. So I say this because the shift has been going to saying, great, we're moving from the fact that let's legally say segregation doesn't exist. And what does that mean as we move from let's recognize diversity, multiculturalism, and yet a certain demographic will still wield most of the power, to where we are now into the future? What does that happen as we have to recognize a big question of justice-oriented work, which is what power are you willing to give up? And that can sound terrifying, but it also means what power are you willing to share? What power are you willing to invite in? What power are you willing to exist with, knowing that the idea is that collectively we want to continue to have some of the same success into the future, rather than these kind of fear-based jarring fractures. And then also, because part of this is, for me, it's closing that as we move with this idea, we have to account for the reality of actually sharing that power. Right? This is one of the things that I started off with early on, which is for me to look at my relationship to nature and the outdoors. If I go out there and I'm going to hike, I'm going to camp, but I also just want those benefits of being at peace, of understanding what my connection to the land is. This is an adaptation by Charles Thomas, who used to work for the National Park Service, looking at how this human object construct that came out of kind of Western scientific method, which is really valuable for us a lot today to like get measurement and data and protection over natural resources. But that still may look a tree being a tree. It's an object, right? And the way that I relate to it is you count it, you measure it, you get data. It's very different if that tree is part of a community that you also belong to. And if we're serious in acknowledging kind of traditional ecological knowledge, and what a lot of the different varying tribal, indigenous, and Native American kind of views of the relationship with nature, it's critical to be sure that we're really opening and expanding that framework and way of thinking to what does that mean, right? So now, yes, you might still cut that tree down. You might still hunt that deer. But how does that change from moving from an objectification, right, to really understanding I'm taking someone from a community, and these are my last two quotes here. One way is to embrace traditional indigenous law, which is rooted in nature and holds individuals accountable for their actions in a reciprocal relationship with environment. Right? So now you're thinking, it says you have relationship and reciprocity in terms of with the land. So I can still recreate it, I'm still enjoying it, but I'm really looking at what's holding kind of, I'll use the terms, this kind of settler colonial structure of bagging that peak, right? Of my relationship to the land is one of conquest. It's still one of taking. I'm not really being mindful of my relationship or reciprocity with this landscape. And to close, this quote from Scott Mamade, which is, "You say that I use the land," and I reply, yes, it is true, but it's not the first truth. The first truth is that I love the land. I see that it is beautiful, I delight in it, I am alive in it. And for me, that opens up such a world of possibilities about what our quote-unquote public land system and its stewardship protection, but also engagement with an ever-growing and changing demographics is going to look like. I'll close with that so we can get to questions.
Terrific. We have questions. There you go.
Thank you. So Sarah, your notion about the parks being and public lands being commons, I really like that and appreciate you sharing that. I will be borrowing that in the near future. So right back at you. For Teresa and Jose, could you share with the audience, if you can, information about the Next 100 Coalition, their impact on policy and on getting people outdoors from folks that are coming from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds?
Rock, paper, scissors.
No, you go first.
Thanks for bringing that up. So yeah, Jose and I were part of an Allen. We're part of a convening in 2015 of a bunch of people of color, organizations that represent people of color in Washington, D.C. that was tied to the 100th anniversary of the national parks. And as we sort of came together, we realized that we were looking forward to the next 100 years of public lands, and what does that mean in a space of making sure that the public lands reflect the faces and the communities that are actually existing in the United States today. And so through that, we created this Next 100 Coalition. That coalition works on public policy. Our big thing to date on a national level was getting a presidential memorandum out of the Obama administration, unfortunately on January 23rd of 2016, that was promptly undone the next day, but to sort of talk about how we create these places of equity and including diversity, equity, and inclusion in some of the practices of federal agencies that deal with public lands. And out of that has also grown a lot of other regional and statewide efforts. There's actually Next 100 Coalition Colorado that is very active. We currently have an exhibit at the American Mountaineering Museum in Golden on Charlie Crenshaw, the first African-American mountaineer. And so there's a great avenue to get involved, next100coalition.org, I think. And then we're active on Facebook as well. So it's a great organization. It's a challenge. We've been struggling even within this community of how we move forward in this day and age. And we sort of said, instead of moving on a national level where it seemed like the administration wasn't really receptive to some of the issues and things we were bringing to the table, we've sort of focused on this more regional, local effort. And it's been a little bit more successful, so.
There was a question up here.
Yes, yeah.
Hi, thank you for speaking today. One thing I've noticed about people in the outdoors, especially through hikers, is that they all have Instagram and they use it extensively. And I was wondering if you could talk about the role of social media. I think in some ways it can strengthen inclusivity and representation, and in other ways brings a lot of people out to a lot of places. So it'd be great to hear about that.
Welcome to my world. I'll start, and I'll just say that I think it's a great thing. So again, national trail systems were created. These systems were created for both maximizing outdoor recreation potential and then also protecting these nationally significant resources. And it is they're schizophrenic, and it's hard to put them together. But we do, and the beauty is that as a trails community, we talk about these things as a collective. You know, we work very closely with folks on the AT and how they're sort of dealing with these thousands of people. So with Instagram, I think it's great. Honestly, I do. I think it's a wonderful thing. People should be sharing their stories, especially as more and more people are out there from different backgrounds and there are a lot more people of color than ever before that I think they represent that ambassador or role model that, hey, if they can do it, I can do that. I will share a really funny story. Last year, Will Robinson, trail name Acuna, there's all these trail names with long-distance hikers. He became the first African-American man to Triple Crown, so he did the AT, PCT, and CDT, and everyone's like, wow, and he was represented by Merrill. He has an Instagram. The unfortunate part about that, which is wonderful that he was the first African-American thru hiker, or male, because in 2018, or 2017, Elsie Chardonnay Walker was the first African-American to Triple Crown the national trails, and she got no press. And she happened, I'm not even going to go there, but there you have it. So I think it's, and she sort of purposely did her Triple Crown unsupported and unsponsored, and really stayed off of social media because she wanted to show you don't have to do that in order to actually be effective. And then she's also moved on to other things. But and I think it's just an interesting dichotomy that even within this space of equity and diversity and inclusion, that there's still the same layers that we all see. So I think it's a good thing. I think it brings up a lot of interesting things that we're just starting to understand.
I'll quickly add, it's a both and.
Mm-hmm.
As with many tools and many lenses. So on the one hand is acknowledging that it is really useful for community building and communication and visibility that wasn't there before. Even just the expansion on Instagram alone as an example of representation of accounts over the past 5 years has been astounding. I stopped keeping track 3 years ago because there were too many. And on the other end is it can amplify both the best and worst of ourselves. So they're not the best places to have some conversations. It is some of the places where it gets really challenging and difficult around, because you still have to look at power and privilege lens to be able to say, oh, we shouldn't geotag this, we shouldn't do that. And I'm like, who's predominantly saying that and for what reasons? Might be good intent, and I even may agree with many of those reasons. I want to pay attention to the impact of that in terms of who gets left out and excluded from that. That's kind of saying, well, what I really am saying is I want these protected for me, and I've gotten the benefit of enjoying these for the past 10 years, and I don't want you, someone new, to come into that space.
Alice, what's our time? Is there another question?
Thanks for a great panel. Relevant to the philosophical differences, a recommendation. Darrell Posey, P-O-S-E-Y, editor, 1997, Cultural and Spiritual Values of Biodiversity, now available free of charge for download from the UN Environment Program.
Sweet, thank you. Can I respond to that as well? Or is that a question?
Did you want to respond, Jose?
I'll take a question, though. I wanted to acknowledge, as that question is getting, saying that that's really critical, and it's been brought up in other conversations. You have to be able to really pay attention to an expression and a statement of protect the sacred as honoring where that's coming from, rather than automatically filtering that through your own religious, especially religious, but other spiritual elements. You have to understand, and that's why I use those quotes at the end. There's a quote I didn't put in there, which is what's most important to you: the land, the people, the ceremonies, the activities, whatever, and they're all the same thing.
We're going to take one more question, I think.
I really appreciated hearing about the public-private partnership and how you use cooperation as a tool for management and to bring in underrepresented voices. I was wondering if any of you would be willing to reflect on the availability and effectiveness of similar strategies for public lands that have other directives related to development in addition to recreation.
So you mean like BLM lands and
Yeah.
so public-private partnerships for our multiple use lands as opposed to our more protective categories?
Maybe I'll take a crack at it. Go ahead, Sarah. Did you want to say it?
No, feel free.
Well,
I mean, there's so
Yeah,
much. There have been experiments that have been tried for sure, and different models with varying results. Mark?
It's an interesting question. I guess I would say that a lot of private extractive uses are in effect a public-private enterprise, right? I mean, you've got the government basically approving a private company to develop the resource. So it's not the same in any way, shape, or form to what Teresa was talking about in terms of public-private partnerships. But there's, of course, a lot of cooperation or integration between the public and private enterprise on our public lands. And, you know, we debate those kinds of issues all the time. But I'm not sure that directly answers your question, but it's the best I can do, I guess.
And I might add just a little bit to that, which is again, also through my lens of working in a trail system, that, you know, in the case of the CDT, we don't have there's no barriers. Like if there's a pipeline or anything like that, we don't stop it because we don't have standing to do that. We can say, like, if you're going to cross the CDT, you can do, you know, it's better if you do it here so it minimizes impact, and let's talk about offsite mitigation in this cumulative space. But I think what I would share is that I think a lot of times when we go into these very multidisciplinary, player conversations and dialogues, is that people want an easy win and they want a quick answer. And unfortunately, these things take time. They take relationship building. They take understanding core values and common values and learning how to speak the same language. the more people you have at the table, the longer that's going to take. And so I think the challenge in any space probably isn't the context of it. It's creating enough time and enough space for those conversations to actually bear fruit. And I think we work and live in a system and a society where it's got to be a right, it's like this. And these things, that's not how humans work. We're freaky. And so, we need time and we need to sort of build a relationship. And what we have found, what can expedite that, though, is going out on the land and actually looking at the site in question and connecting there first. And then that actually helps say, oh, wait, we have the same values. We both love these things. Okay, you're not this evil entity. You're a human who has a value, and how can we make this a win-win as best as possible? So I would just say that it's more of a process than a place-space thing. So
Thanks.
The old line about letting the resource speak for itself.
yes. Yeah.
I think this was really a terrific panel, so thanks to all our panelists, and please join me.
All right, we have a break set up. Honor system, back in your seats. 3:45. We have a really great panel to conclude the day, and thank you all for being here. And again, this was a really fascinating panel. So 3:45.